Do you think a queen, crowned and celebrated, held absolute sway over her kingdom in 1192? Did her royal title truly guarantee unlimited power? What if we told you that even the most formidable queens of the High Middle Ages faced a tangled web of restrictions, expectations, and plain old societal norms that kept their influence in check, often in ways that would shock you today? Number 12, patriarchal society and legal status. Imagine a world where your very existence as a woman, no matter how highborn, meant you were, by default, considered legally subordinate to men. This wasn't some minor inconvenience in 1192. It was the bedrock of medieval society, a deeply ingrained belief system that permeated every aspect of life, from the lowliest peasant's cottage to the grandest royal court. Even a queen, despite her magnificent title, was not immune to this fundamental truth. Her legal standing, her property rights, her ability to make independent decisions, all were shadowed by the pervasive dominance of male authority. Think about it, from the moment a girl was born, her path was largely dictated by the men in her life. First, her father, who had ultimate control over her marriage, her dowry, and her general upbringing. Then, upon marriage, her identity was, in a legal sense, largely subsumed by her husband's. This concept, known as coverture in later English common law, meant that a married woman had little to no independent legal identity. Her husband was her legal representative, her voice in the courts, and the one who held authority over her property and her person. While a queen might seem to stand above such mundane restrictions, the spirit of this legal framework still clung to her. She was first and foremost the king's wife, a part of his household, and an extension of his authority, rather than a separate, independent power source in her own right. Consider the intricacies of medieval jurisprudence. The queen wished to engage in a legal dispute, perhaps concerning her dower lands or a debt owed to her. She often had to do so through her husband or a male representative. She couldn't simply walk into court and present her case as an independent entity. This was not a unique plight for queens, it was the standard for all women. However, for a queen, whose decisions could impact an entire realm, this legal subjugation took on monumental significance. It meant that even her personal finances, separate from the kingdom's treasury, were often managed by her husband or a male steward acting on his behalf. Access to funds, her ability to loan money or enter into contracts, was constrained by these deeply embedded legal norms. The very language of power, too, reflected this male-centric view. Laws, charters, and decrees were almost invariably issued in the king's name. When a queen acted, even in a regency, she was almost always doing so on behalf of the king, either as his representative or as the guardian of his heir. Her authority was derivative, a temporary extension of male power, rather than an inherent right of her own. This wasn't just a formality, it carried real weight. A powerful lord or a disgruntled bishop wished to challenge a royal directive issued by the queen. They might subtly, or not so subtly, question the legitimacy of her independent power, arguing that she lacked the inherent authority of a male sovereign. Even a queen's personal security and freedom of movement were, in many ways, under the king's purview. Her household, while extensive and staffed by her own loyal servants, was still ultimately part of the larger royal household, funded and authorized by the king. If she wished to travel, even within the kingdom, her journeys were often arranged and approved by her husband. While there were certainly strong, influential queens who defied these norms in practice, the legal and social structures of 1192 consistently reinforced the idea that women, even those on the throne, operated within a framework defined and controlled by men. This deeply rooted patriarchal society, with its laws and customs, formed an invisible, yet incredibly strong, barrier to a queen's independent exercise of power. It meant that no matter her intellect, her ambition, or her force of personality, she always had to navigate a system designed to limit her agency as a woman, and that was a monumental challenge. Number 11, inheritance laws and the preference for male heirs. Imagine spending your entire life being told your primary purpose, your most important duty, was to produce a son. Not just any child, but a male heir, a sturdy boy who would ensure the continuation of the royal line and prevent your kingdom from falling into chaos or the hands of a distant, possibly hostile relative. This wasn't some quaint historical expectation. It was a relentless pressure cooker that defined the lives of medieval queens, overshadowing almost every other aspect of their existence and severely limiting their independent power. In 1192, the rules of succession, whether formal or customary, almost universally favored males, making a queen's position incredibly precarious if she failed in this one vital role. The concept of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits everything, was becoming increasingly entrenched across Western Europe by the late 12th century. This meant that even if a queen had a daughter, no matter how intelligent or capable, that daughter would almost always be passed over in favor of a younger brother, a male cousin, or even a more distant male relative. The idea of a woman ruling in her own right, as a queen regnant rather than a queen consort, the king's wife, was exceedingly rare and often viewed with deep suspicion and apprehension. Why? Because a female ruler was seen as inherently weaker, less capable of leading armies, defending borders, or commanding the respect of fierce, battle-hardened vassals. Think about the sheer political instability that could erupt if a queen failed to produce a son. The king might seek an annulment, effectively divorcing her and casting her aside, all in the desperate hope of finding a new wife who could bear him a male heir. This wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a political earthquake. Queen's dower lands, her household, her personal influence, all could be stripped away. Family, perhaps a powerful foreign dynasty, would be insulted and alienated, potentially leading to diplomatic crises or even war. Her entire identity, her purpose within the kingdom, was tied to her womb, to the promise of a son who would carry on the name and secure the future. Consider Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval era. Even she, with her vast inherited lands and formidable intellect, faced immense pressure to produce heirs. She bore her first husband, King Louis VII of France, only daughters. This contributed significantly to the annulment of their marriage, as Louis desperately needed a son to secure the Capetian dynasty. When she married Henry II of England, she finally bore him sons, including the future Richard the Lionheart and John Lackland. Her ability to provide male heirs cemented her position and power, but imagine if she hadn't. Her legacy, and perhaps even the course of Anglo-French history, might have been dramatically different. Her initial struggle with Louis serves as a stark reminder of how deeply a queen's value was intertwined with her fertility and her capacity to bear male children. This preference for males wasn't just about direct succession to the throne, it extended to all levels of inherited power and property. Noble families, just like royal ones, desperately sought sons to ensure their estates and titles passed down intact. A queen who came from a powerful family that lacked male heirs might inherit vast territories, as Eleanor did with Aquitaine, making her an incredibly valuable marriage prospect. However, once married, her lands would typically become intertwined with her husband's, managed by him, and eventually inherited by their male children. She was a conduit for wealth and power, but rarely its ultimate, independent controller. Constant anxiety about succession meant that a queen's political power was often indirectly tied to her childbearing. She might exert influence through her husband, urging him towards certain policies or alliances, but her leverage often came from her perceived value as a potential mother of future kings, rather than her own intrinsic political skill or legal authority. If she was past childbearing age, or if her husband already had a clear line of succession, her personal influence might diminish. The specter of a disputed succession, a civil war over who had the rightful claim to the throne, haunted medieval monarchies. And in that terrifying scenario, a queen who couldn't provide a clear male heir was seen not just as a failure, but as a direct threat to the stability of the realm. Her very body became a political battleground, and her personal power was relentlessly constrained by this singular, existential demand. Number 10. Military leadership and warfare. In 1192, the image of a king was inextricably linked with the battlefield. He was a warrior, a commander, expected to lead his knights into the fray, conquer lands, and defend his realm with sword and shield. This expectation was so deeply ingrained in the medieval psyche that it was almost impossible to imagine a true sovereign who wasn't also a military leader. Now, consider a queen. Despite her crown and her royal blood, she was, by custom and by expectation, largely excluded from this most vital and defining aspect of kingship. This was a massive limitation on her actual power, even if she possessed keen strategic insight or fierce courage. Think about the logistics of medieval warfare. It was brutal, physical, and highly masculine. Kings were expected to ride at the head of their armies, personally lead charges, and be present during sieges and skirmishes. Convened war councils with their most trusted male, generals and knights. They made life or death decisions on the field. The queen, by contrast, was expected to remain in the relative safety of the court, managing the household, raising the children, and perhaps overseeing the finances while her husband was away. Her role during wartime was often to act as a regent, yes, but even then, her primary duty was to maintain order and gather resources for the king's war effort, not to plan campaigns or command troops. There were, of course, exceptions, but they were almost always born out of desperate necessity rather than accepted practice. Eleanor of Aquitaine, while incredibly powerful and influential, did not lead armies into battle. Her son, Richard the Lionheart, was famous for his military prowess, leading the Third Crusade. While he was away, Eleanor worked tirelessly to secure his lands, gather funds, and counter the plots of his treacherous brother, John. She exercised immense political power, but her power was administrative and diplomatic, not military. She was raising funds for armies, not commanding them. Consider the societal perceptions. If the queen were to don armor and attempt to lead an army, she would likely face ridicule, resistance, and outright defiance from her own male nobility. Knights and lords had sworn fealty to a king, a warrior, someone they could respect on the battlefield. The idea of taking orders from a woman, particularly one who couldn't physically fight alongside them, was deeply anathema to their martial code and their sense of honor. It would be seen as a sign of weakness in the kingdom, an affront to chivalry, and a challenge to the established order. This limitation wasn't just about direct combat. It extended to strategic planning and diplomatic negotiations related to war. While a queen might advise her husband on alliances or peace treaties, she was rarely the one making the final military decisions or sitting at the negotiating table with battle-scarred foreign monarchs. The language of diplomacy was often cloaked in military metaphors, and a queen's voice, no matter how astute, could easily be dismissed if she lacked the perceived authority of a military commander. Even when a queen did find herself in a position of defending her lands, perhaps during a siege, her actions were often framed as a courageous act of defense until a male rescuer could arrive, rather than an independent act of military leadership. For instance, the defenders of castles might fight ferociously for their queen, but their ultimate loyalty and expectation of command rested with the king or a designated male captain. The inability to lead armies wasn't just a personal deficiency for the queen, it was a systemic barrier to independent rule. A monarch who could not command military might was, in the medieval world, fundamentally incomplete. It meant that even the most formidable queen had to rely on male generals, male knights, and male vassals to execute her will militarily. Power in this crucial domain was always mediated, always indirect, and always subject to the willingness of men to follow her commands. This fundamental exclusion from the ultimate expression of royal power, the ability to wage war and defend the realm, meant that even the most powerful queen was always operating with one hand tied behind her back, no matter how brilliantly she managed the internal affairs of the kingdom. Number 9. Financial dependence and dower lands. Imagine holding a magnificent title, wearing a crown studded with jewels, yet having very little direct control over the vast wealth flowing into the royal treasury. This was the reality for many queens in 1192. While a queen certainly lived in luxury, her financial power was often indirect, largely dependent on the king's generosity, and primarily derived from specific arrangements like her dower lands, rather than independent access to the kingdom's general revenues. This severely limited her ability to pursue her own initiatives, reward her own loyalists, or truly act as an independent financial force. The queen's primary source of income and influence typically came from her dower, or mourning gift. This was a portion of the kingdom's lands or income set aside for her use during her lifetime, usually after the death of her husband. The idea was to provide for her widowhood and ensure she maintained a dignified status. While these dower lands could be extensive and financially significant, they were rarely under her full, undisputed control while the king was alive. The king might manage them, or his administrators might collect the revenues and disperse them to her. Her access to these funds was often contingent on his favor. Think about the king's vast revenues: taxes collected from towns and peasants, feudal dues from vassals, customs duties from trade, income from royal forests and mines, and fines from justice. These immense sums flowed directly into the royal treasury, managed by the king's exchequer or chamber. A queen typically had no direct access to this general treasury. She had her own household accounts, yes, funded by specific allocations from the king or from her dower lands, but she couldn't simply command funds from the kingdom's main coffers for her own projects or to pay off a political debt. Consider the implications of this financial structure. The queen wanted to sponsor a particular church, or commission a new set of tapestries, or even contribute significantly to a charitable cause. She often had to seek the king's approval or rely on the limited funds from her dower. She couldn't just dip into the royal treasury as the king could. This meant her ability to patronize arts, sciences, or religious institutions, which was a significant way for monarchs to project power and garner loyalty, was constrained by her husband's financial decisions. Eleanor of Aquitaine, again, provides a fascinating case study. She was immensely wealthy in her own right, holding vast territories that she inherited. However, once she married Henry II, these lands became part of the Angevin Empire, and their administration was largely handled by royal officials under Henry's ultimate authority. While she certainly retained personal control and income from her dower and certain properties, the overall financial engine of the kingdom was driven by the king. When she was imprisoned by Henry for years, her financial autonomy was severely curtailed, even though she technically retained her dower rights. Her release and active role as regent under Richard I saw her regain significant financial sway, but even then, she was managing the kingdom's finances for Richard, not as an independent queen regnant with her own purse. The lack of independent financial power also impacted a queen's ability to reward loyalty. The king could grant lands, titles, and pensions to his loyal supporters from the vast royal patrimony, binding them to him with golden chains. A queen's ability to do this was far more limited. She might have personal gifts, jewels, or small grants from her dower, but she couldn't make the kind of large-scale financial commitments that secured the long-term loyalty of powerful magnates. This meant her political influence often had to be built on persuasion, personal charm, and connections, rather than the raw power of financial patronage. Even in times of crisis, when a queen might be acting as regent, her financial authority was usually temporary and contingent. She would be overseeing the collection of taxes and revenues for the king's benefit, perhaps for a crusade or a war, but she wasn't fundamentally changing the financial landscape of the kingdom or redirecting its primary wealth to her own independent agenda. Her control was administrative, not proprietary. This fundamental dependence on the king for her financial well-being and her exclusion from the kingdom's main treasury was a silent but incredibly potent limitation on a queen's actual power, forcing her to operate within a very carefully defined financial sphere. Number 8, role as childbearer and succession pressure. Imagine that your entire worth, your very purpose, the measure of your success as a royal figure, boiled down to one thing: your ability to produce children, specifically male ones. This wasn't a side gig for a queen in 1192. It was arguably her most critical, non-negotiable duty. The relentless pressure to provide an heir, a male heir, was an omnipresent force that shaped a queen's life, her influence, and her very survival at court, often overriding any political acumen or personal ambition she might possess. The primary function of a medieval royal marriage was dynastic, to ensure the continuation of the ruling line. In an era where infant mortality was terrifyingly high and life expectancy was low, producing multiple healthy sons was paramount. Each birth was a national event, celebrated if it was a boy, met with quiet disappointment if it was a girl. The queen's body became a vessel for the kingdom's future, and her personal identity was often subsumed by this vital, reproductive role. Think about the psychological toll this must have taken. Every pregnancy was a gamble. Every miscarriage, every stillbirth, every daughter brought a fresh wave of anxiety and potentially political fallout. The queen who failed to produce a male heir risked not just personal sorrow, but the threat of annulment, repudiation, or even being sent to a convent. Her position, no matter how grand, was incredibly precarious if the crib remained empty or only daughters graced the royal nursery. Consider the case of Isabella of Angoulême, who would later marry King John, Richard the Lionheart's brother, after 1192. Even before her marriage, her value as a potential queen lay almost entirely in her youth and her presumed fertility. Her youth meant she had many potential childbearing years ahead of her, making her a desirable match for a king desperate for a male successor. Personal qualities, her intelligence, her temperament, while perhaps considered, were secondary to this fundamental biological capacity. This immense pressure wasn't just about ensuring the line, it was also about preventing civil war. Clear, undisputed male heir was the best guarantee against rival claimants, rebellious nobles, and foreign intervention. Without one, the kingdom could plunge into decades of instability and bloodshed. Therefore, a queen's fertility wasn't just a personal matter, it was a matter of state security. This meant her activities, her health, even her diet, could be scrutinized for their impact on her ability to conceive and carry a child to term. The queen's personal household, her ladies-in-waiting, and even the royal physicians often had a role in managing her health and encouraging her fertility. Superstitions, prayers, and even medical concoctions were employed in the hope of ensuring a successful pregnancy. This constant focus on her reproductive capacity meant that her political influence was often judged through the lens of her potential as a mother of kings. If she successfully bore sons, her status and informal power might increase. If she failed, her influence could wane dramatically, regardless of her other skill. Even if a queen was a brilliant diplomat or a shrewd administrator, her inability to secure the succession could render all her other efforts irrelevant. Her political capital could plummet overnight. The very foundation of her existence as a queen, the ultimate reason for her marriage to the king, was tied to her womb. This inescapable pressure to provide heirs, particularly male ones, was a relentless and deeply personal limitation that overshadowed every aspect of a queen's power, forcing her to live with the constant shadow of potential failure and the threat of political obsolescence. It was a constraint that permeated every facet of her royal life, from the moment she was married until she had safely delivered sons or her childbearing years were well past. Number 7. Religious doctrine and church influence. Imagine living in a world where the most powerful institution, arguably even more powerful than any individual monarch, was the church. Doctrines permeated every corner of society, shaping laws, morals, and perceptions of gender role. In 1192, the Roman Catholic Church held immense sway over secular rulers, and its teachings, often interpreted in highly conservative ways, reinforced the idea of female subservience, thereby subtly but powerfully limiting a queen's actual power. The Church's view on women was complex, but generally leaned towards emphasizing their role as pious, chaste, and obedient figures. Biblical interpretations, particularly those drawing from the letters of St. Paul, often presented women as subordinate to men, created to be helpers and destined for domestic roles. While the Virgin Mary was revered as a powerful intercessor, her power was seen as spiritual and maternal, not temporal or political. This theological framework meant that a queen, no matter her earthly status, was still seen through the lens of a gender hierarchy ordained by God. Think about the sermons preached in churches, the illuminated manuscripts studied in monasteries, and the legal pronouncements of canon law. All these sources often reiterated the idea that a woman's place was within the household, or in prayer, not on the battlefield, or in the council chamber. While some abbesses could wield significant power within their convents, this was spiritual and administrative power within a defined religious sphere, not temporal rule over a kingdom. The Church also exerted significant influence over royal marriages and divorces, annulments. If the king wished to set aside his wife, he often needed the Church's approval, typically based on grounds of consanguinity, being too closely related, or non-consummation. This gave the Church immense leverage over the queen's very position. Her marriage, the foundation of her royal status, could be dissolved by an ecclesiastical court, leaving her vulnerable and stripped of her power. This power was wielded by male churchmen, bishops, archbishops, and the Pope, who were unlikely to challenge prevailing gender norms. Consider the role of confessors and spiritual advisors. Queens, like all medieval people, were deeply religious. Confessors, often powerful and learned clerics, held significant influence over their spiritual and moral guidance. These male figures could subtly, or not so subtly, guide a queen's decisions, reinforcing traditional gender roles and discouraging any overt displays of independent political ambition that might be seen as unfeminine or ungodly. The Church, in essence, was a powerful, ubiquitous voice that whispered into the ears of kings and queens alike, constantly reinforcing the idea that women's authority was to be limited and channeled through their husbands. Even in times of crisis, when a queen might step forward as regent, her authority might be implicitly questioned by conservative churchmen who preferred male leadership. While the church might bless a regency in the absence of a king, its underlying doctrine still favored male dominion. A queen who appeared too ambitious or too assertive might find herself subtly undermined by powerful bishops who cited religious texts to argue for male supremacy in all matters of temporal rule. The church's moral authority also shaped public opinion. The queen acted in a way that was deemed unwomanly or unholy by the church. Her reputation could be severely damaged, eroding her popular support and making it harder for her to exercise any form of power. This was not always an explicit limitation, but a deep-seated cultural and spiritual one, influencing the attitudes of the nobility and the common people alike. The pervasive moral and theological authority of the church, with its unwavering commitment to a patriarchal world order, served as a powerful, unspoken constraint on a queen's actual power, reminding her and everyone else that her authority was always, ultimately, secondary to the divine order as interpreted by men. Number 6. Counsel and advisors. Imagine being the queen, but knowing that the true power brokers, the men who advised the king on matters of state, law, and war, were almost exclusively male and often viewed your contributions with polite skepticism or even outright disdain. In 1192, a king's council was the engine room of government, a body of powerful barons, seasoned knights, and influential bishops who held the reins of executive power. The queen might have her own personal household and trusted confidants, but gaining meaningful influence within the king's inner circle was a formidable challenge, a silent but significant limitation on her actual power. The king's council was, by its very nature, a male-dominated space. These men were selected for their military prowess, their legal expertise, their administrative experience, or their vast landholdings and feudal power. They were often rough, pragmatic individuals, accustomed to the company of other men, and steeped in a culture where women were generally excluded from serious political discourse. While a queen might be present at court, perhaps even seated beside the king during formal assemblies, her voice carried a different weight than that of a powerful earl or an archbishop. Think about the dynamics of such a council. Decisions about taxation, military campaigns, diplomatic treaties, and judicial matters were thrashed out by men who saw themselves as the natural leaders of the realm. If the queen attempted to interject or push a particular agenda, she might be seen as overstepping her bounds, encroaching on male territory, or even as being guided by frivolous, feminine concerns rather than the serious business of statecraft. Her advice, if given, was often filtered through the king, who would then present it as his own, or risk having it dismissed outright if attributed to her. Consider the composition of a queen's own household. She would have her ladies-in-waiting, her chaplains, her stewards, and her clerks. These were her personal staff, loyal to her, and essential for managing her vast domestic affairs. However, these advisors rarely held the same political gravitas as the king's chief minister or his most powerful marshal. They were not the men who commanded armies, negotiated treaties with foreign powers, or oversaw the kingdom's legal system. Therefore, even if a queen received excellent counsel from her own retinue, she lacked the direct channels to implement large-scale policy decisions. Eleanor of Aquitaine, during Richard's absence on crusade, provides a powerful counterexample, yet even her experience highlights the underlying limitation. She was undeniably a formidable regent, but she gained her power through a combination of her unparalleled personal authority, her immense inherited wealth, and the fact that she was acting for her beloved son, the absent king. Even then, she had to navigate the treacherous political landscape, constantly asserting her authority against ambitious male nobles like John Lackland, who sought to undermine her regency and usurp the throne. She couldn't just walk into a council meeting and command respect simply because she was queen. She earned it through decades of political maneuvering and a force of will that few, male or female, could match. The unspoken rule was that a queen's influence was best exercised through private counsel with her husband. She might sway his opinion in the bedchamber or during private conversations, but rarely did she openly debate policy with his male advisors in a formal setting. This meant her influence was often indirect, hidden, and reliant on her personal relationship with the king. If that relationship soured, or if the king preferred the counsel of his male cronies, her access to power could be severely curtailed. This exclusion from the inner sanctum of male power was a constant, subtle reminder that the ultimate authority rested with the king and his chosen male advisor. It meant that even a queen with exceptional political acumen had to work harder, more subtly, and often behind the scenes, to make her voice heard and her will felt in the governance of the realm. King's counsel, therefore, stood as a formidable, almost impenetrable barrier to a queen's direct and independent exercise of power, forcing her to rely on persuasion rather than outright command. Number 5. Vassal loyalty and the feudal system. Imagine a kingdom where power was not neatly centralized in the king's hands, but distributed among a network of powerful, often fiercely independent, lords and barons. These men, known as vassals, swore oaths of fealty and military service directly to the king, not to his queen. This intricate web of personal loyalties, the very foundation of the feudal system in 1192, created a massive, often insurmountable, barrier to a queen's independent exercise of power. Her authority, if any, was almost always derivative, a temporary extension of the king's. Feudal contract was simple. A lord granted land, a fief, to a vassal, and in return the vassal swore an oath of homage and fealty, promising military service, counsel, and financial aid. This oath was a deeply personal bond, linking man to man. It was virtually unheard of for a powerful baron to swear direct, independent fealty to a queen, unless she was a queen regnant in her own right, inheriting her lands and titles directly, a rare occurrence. Even then, as with Eleanor of Aquitaine and her duchy, her vassals would swear fealty to her as their direct lord, but the broader feudal network of the kingdom still revolved around the king. Think about the implications when the king was away, perhaps on crusade, as Richard the Lionheart was in 1192. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, acted as regent, wielding immense power. But even she, with all her experience and force of personality, had to constantly assert her authority over a nobility that was accustomed to swearing direct oaths to a male sovereign. John Lackland, Richard's ambitious brother, constantly tried to exploit this dynamic, attempting to draw vassals away from Eleanor's authority and towards himself, arguing that he was the legitimate heir in Richard's absence, and therefore the rightful recipient of their loyalty. This wasn't just a theoretical problem, it was a practical one. The queen issued a command perhaps to raise taxes or to muster troops. A powerful vassal might subtly, or not so subtly, question her authority. Was this command truly from the king, or was it the queen's own initiative? Did their oath of fealty truly bind them to obey her in the same way they would obey the king? This ambiguity could lead to delays, defiance, and outright rebellion, severely hampering the queen's ability to govern effectively. Consider the culture of medieval chivalry and warfare. Knights and barons were warriors, accustomed to following male leaders into battle. The idea of taking orders from a woman, particularly one who could not lead them physically or command their respect on the battlefield, was often antithetical to their ingrained sense of honor and hierarchy. They might treat her with respect as the king's wife, but their ultimate allegiance and willingness to obey rested with the male sovereign. Even when a queen brought vast lands to her marriage, as Eleanor of Aquitaine did, her vassals from those lands would ultimately become the king's vassals, their fealty transferred to him. While she might retain personal influence over them, their primary obligation was to the male ruler of the unified realm. This meant that a queen, despite her status, often lacked a direct, independent power base of loyal vassals who owed her personal service. Power was almost always mediated through her husband, or, in a regency, temporarily delegated from her husband. This inherent lack of direct, personal feudal loyalty was a profound limitation. It meant that a queen, even when acting with the full support of her husband, always had to contend with the underlying reality that the powerful men of the realm ultimately saw themselves as bound to the king, not to her. Their obedience to her was often conditional, based on her relationship with the king, or on her ability to leverage her personal prestige. This fundamental structural element of medieval society, the feudal system built on male-to-male fealty, ensured that a queen's actual power was always circumscribed by the loyalties that bound men directly to the throne, leaving her often in the position of a powerful proxy rather than an independent authority. Number 4. Geographical mobility in public life. Imagine being a queen, a figurehead of immense status, yet largely confined to the royal court, your movements often dictated by convenience, security, and the pervasive expectation that your primary role was to manage the royal household and bear children. In 1192, while queens certainly traveled, their geographical mobility and engagement in public life were often far more restricted than a king's, a subtle yet significant limitation on their actual power and ability to project authority throughout the realm. Kings were constantly on the move. They traveled to dispense justice, to lead armies, to meet with vassals, to hunt, and to inspect their lands. Presence in different parts of the kingdom was a vital aspect of their rule, allowing them to assert authority, resolve disputes, and maintain direct contact with their subjects. The king's power was literally seen and felt across his domain through his physical presence. The queen, however, was generally expected to remain at a central court, typically the main royal residence or a well-fortified castle. Primary duties were domestic, overseeing the royal household, managing the vast retinue of servants, and crucially, raising the royal children. Her world was often confined to the palace walls, and her public appearances were largely ceremonial or religious, attending mass, receiving foreign dignitaries in the king's name, or performing acts of charity. These were important roles, certainly, but they were largely static and symbolic, rather than active exercises of political power. Think about the practicalities. Travel in the 12th century was arduous and dangerous. Roads were poor, security was uncertain, and accommodation could be primitive. While a king might endure these hardships to campaign or dispense justice, a queen, especially if pregnant or with young children, was often seen as too vulnerable to undertake extensive, unescorted journeys. Her safety was paramount, as she was the vessel for the royal succession. This meant her movements were often carefully controlled and heavily guarded, further limiting her independence. Consider the contrast between Richard the Lionheart, who spent most of his reign outside England on crusade or fighting in France, and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. While Eleanor certainly traveled extensively, particularly during her regency to secure Richard's release and suppress John's rebellion, these journeys were often in response to urgent political crises. She wasn't simply traversing the kingdom as a matter of routine governance or to personally project authority in the same way a king would. Travels were strategic necessities rather than expressions of inherent freedom of movement. And even Eleanor, arguably the most mobile queen of her time, faced limitations on where she could go and the personal dangers involved. Even when a queen did travel, perhaps accompanying her husband on a royal progress, her role was often supportive and ceremonial. She was there to enhance the king's prestige, to provide a sense of royal legitimacy, and to be a symbol of dynastic continuity, rather than to engage directly in the legal, administrative, or military affairs of the realm. Public visibility was carefully managed, designed to project an image of piety, grace, and fertility, not independent political might. This limited mobility meant that a queen had fewer opportunities to directly influence local administration, to build personal relationships with powerful regional lords, or to address grievances from subjects across the kingdom. Her influence had to be channeled through others, often through her husband or his male administrators. She might receive petitions, but the actual implementation of justice or policy lay with the king and his agents. The expectation that a queen remain largely ensconced within the royal household, managing domestic affairs and securing the succession, was a deeply ingrained cultural norm. It was a silent but persistent constraint on her ability to truly engage with the broader political landscape of the kingdom. While some exceptional queens did break free of these geographical and public life restrictions, their actions were often seen as extraordinary, a deviation from the norm, highlighting just how powerful this societal expectation was as a limitation on a queen's actual power. Number 3, public image and propaganda. Imagine a queen who, no matter how brilliant or politically astute, was primarily portrayed through a very narrow, idealized lens, as a beautiful, pious, fertile mother of kings, a symbol of dynastic continuity and domestic harmony. In 1192, the public image of a queen was meticulously crafted, often through chronicles, songs, and visual art, to serve the interests of the male monarchy, rather than to reflect her true capabilities or independent authority. This carefully managed propaganda was a powerful, subtle limitation on her actual power, shaping how she was perceived by nobles and commoners alike. Medieval society relied heavily on symbols and narratives to convey power and legitimacy. For a king, the imagery was clear: a valiant warrior, a wise judge, a benevolent ruler chosen by God. For a queen, the narrative was different. She was the Regina, the consort, the king's helpmate. Her value was often measured by her beauty, her piety, her fertility, and her ability to provide an heir. She was the embodiment of stability and purity, the spiritual heart of the kingdom, rather than its active political brain. Think about how queens were depicted in contemporary chronicles and literature. They were often praised for their grace, their charitable works, their religious devotion, and their success in bearing sons. They were rarely celebrated for their military strategy, their legal acumen, or their diplomatic prowess, even if they possessed such qualities. When a queen did exert significant political influence, it was often framed as acting on behalf of her husband or son, or in response to a crisis, rather than as an independent act of sovereignty. Consider Berengaria of Navarre, who married Richard the Lionheart in 1191. She was Queen of England but spent almost no time there, often accompanying Richard on crusade or residing in his French territories. Public image in England would have been largely conceptual, a foreign bride who was hoped to bear Richard an heir. There was little opportunity for her to build a personal political identity or exert independent influence within the kingdom, as her public role was almost entirely defined by her relationship to the absent king. Image was that of the king's wife, a future mother, rather than a political player in her own right. This carefully controlled public image wasn't just a matter of historical record, it shaped popular perception and noble expectation. The queen tried to overstep these boundaries, to act in a way that was perceived as too masculine or too independently ambitious. She risked public condemnation or the alienation of powerful nobles. She might be accused of usurping male authority, or of being a domineering wife, or even of dabbling in witchcraft, a particularly dangerous accusation. Propaganda machine, controlled by male chroniclers and churchmen, could easily turn against her, undermining her reputation and her ability to govern. Even a powerful regent like Eleanor of Aquitaine had to carefully manage her public image. While she was undoubtedly formidable and highly capable, contemporary accounts often emphasized her age, her piety, and her wisdom, rather than her direct political shrewdness or her iron will. Power was often implicitly framed as a temporary stewardship, a matriarch protecting her son's interests, rather than a direct assumption of sovereign power. She leveraged her image as the king's devoted mother to garner support, rather than projecting an image of an independent ruler. The ideal queen was often presented as a moral compass, a patron of the church, a symbol of domestic virtue, and a link to foreign alliances through marriage. These roles, while important, were largely passive and supportive, rather than active and decisive. This constant reinforcement of a specific, limited female archetype meant that a queen's actual power was often hidden, indirect, and constantly battling against a prevailing narrative that confined her to a very specific and ultimately subordinate symbolic role. This subtle but pervasive form of propaganda, shaping what was considered proper for a queen, was a constant check on her ability to openly and independently exercise her authority. Number 2, foreign origin and otherness. Imagine arriving in a new country, a new court, speaking a different language, perhaps holding different customs, all while being expected to instantly become the symbol of the nation and the mother of its future kings. For many medieval queens, their foreign origin was not just a personal challenge, but a significant political limitation on their actual power, often creating a sense of otherness that made it difficult to gain trust, build independent alliances, or truly integrate into the political landscape. In 1192, royal marriages were strategic alliances designed to secure peace, consolidate power, or acquire new territories. This often meant kings married foreign princesses from distant lands. While these marriages brought diplomatic benefits, they also brought a queen who was, by definition, an outsider. She arrived without a pre-existing network of loyal vassals, without deep knowledge of the local laws and customs, and often without a fluent grasp of the native language. Think about the immediate challenges. A foreign queen might struggle to communicate effectively with local nobles, administrators, or even her own household staff in the early days. Her foreign accent or cultural misunderstandings could be mocked or misinterpreted. She might unintentionally offend local customs or traditions. This immediate hurdle made it difficult to build rapport and trust, which were vital for exercising informal power and influence. Consider Berengaria of Navarre, who married Richard the Lionheart in Cyprus in 1191. She spent her initial years as queen accompanying Richard on the Third Crusade, and very little time in England itself. While she was queen consort, her foreign birth and prolonged absence from the kingdom meant she could not cultivate a personal power base, build relationships with English nobility, or establish any independent influence in England. To the English people, she remained largely an abstract figure, defined solely by her status as Richard's wife, rather than a known political entity. This otherness often led to suspicion. Native nobles might view the foreign queen as representing the interests of her birth family, rather than the interests of her new kingdom. She might be accused of favoring foreign advisors or of siphoning wealth away to her home country. This suspicion could translate into resistance against her influence or outright defiance if she tried to exert authority during a regency or in the king's absence. Even if a foreign queen made a genuine effort to adapt and integrate, the underlying prejudice could persist for years, even decades. Her loyalty might always be implicitly questioned, and her influence might be seen as dangerous or divisive. She was reliant on the king's unwavering support and protection to overcome this inherent disadvantage. King's favor waned, or if he died, her position could become incredibly precarious. This was a particularly acute problem for queens who found themselves as regents. While Eleanor of Aquitaine, herself of French origin, was an exception due to her immense personal power, long tenure, and direct hereditary claims, many other foreign queens acting as regents faced challenges asserting authority over a suspicious native nobility who preferred local leadership. The subtle questions of who is she really loyal to, or does she truly understand our ways, could undermine even the most intelligent and well-meaning foreign queen. The fact that many queens were essentially imported for political gain meant that they often lacked the deep, familial connections within the nobility that a king possessed. Couldn't rely on existing blood ties or long-standing feudal relationships to build support. Instead, they had to cultivate new alliances, often dependent on the king's favor and their own personal charm. This inherent disadvantage, stemming from their foreign origin, was a constant, underlying limitation on a queen's ability to wield independent power, making her vulnerable to suspicion and requiring her to work twice as hard to establish her authority within her adopted realm. Number 1. Regency challenges. Imagine holding the reins of an entire kingdom, making life or death decisions, managing rebellions, and raising vast sums of money, all while knowing that your authority is temporary, often contested, and ultimately subject to the whims of powerful men who resent your very position. This was the incredibly precarious reality for a queen acting as regent in 1192, particularly Eleanor of Aquitaine, who famously ruled England in the absence of her son, Richard the Lionheart, while he was on crusade. Despite wielding immense de facto power, the inherent challenges of a regency were a profound and pervasive limitation on a queen's actual power, leaving her constantly battling for legitimacy and control. A regency occurred when the king was absent on crusade, like Richard, too young to rule a minority, or incapacitated. In such times, a regent was appointed to govern on his behalf. While this presented a rare opportunity for a queen to step into the political spotlight, her authority was fundamentally different from that of a king. A king ruled by divine right and hereditary succession, a regent ruled by delegation, and her power was always considered temporary. Think about the instability this created. Powerful nobles, always jockeying for more influence, often saw a regency as a chance to grab power or undermine the regent's authority. They might argue that the queen, as a woman, lacked the inherent legitimacy of a male sovereign. They might exploit the king's absence to pursue their own agendas, knowing that the regent might not have the same power to command their obedience or punish their defiance. This was precisely the challenge Eleanor of Aquitaine faced with her younger son, John Lackland, who actively conspired against her rule and sought to usurp his brother's throne while Richard was imprisoned. Eleanor had to employ all her political genius, her vast network of connections, and her legendary resolve to suppress John's rebellion and maintain order. The regent queen also lacked the military authority of a king. While she could order armies to be raised and dispatched, she couldn't personally lead them into battle, which was a fundamental expectation of a sovereign. This meant she had to rely on male generals, whose loyalty might be divided or whose ambitions might conflict with her own. She might command the kingdom, but she couldn't command the battlefield in the same direct, personal way. Furthermore, a regent's power was always subject to the king's eventual return or the heir's coming of age. This meant her decisions, however crucial, could potentially be overturned once the king resumed power. This underlying temporariness could make powerful lords hesitant to commit fully to her policies or to swear unquestioning allegiance, knowing that the ultimate authority would eventually shift back to a male monarch. This also meant she had to constantly consider the king's wishes, even if he was absent, and ensure her actions wouldn't alienate him upon his return. Even financing a regency was fraught with challenges. While a queen regent might control the royal treasury, she was doing so on behalf of the absent king. Primary duty was to maintain the kingdom's stability and revenues for his return, not to implement her own long-term visions or lavish patronage in the same way a king might. She was a steward, not a sovereign in her own right. Eleanor of Aquitaine's unparalleled success as regent for Richard was an extraordinary exception, not the rule. Her long life, her vast inherited lands, her deep political experience, and her fierce devotion to her son gave her unique leverage. Yet even she constantly battled against the inherent instability of a regency, the challenges of a disloyal son, and the machinations of foreign power. Power was hard-won, constantly asserted, and ultimately dependent on her ability to navigate a system that fundamentally preferred male rule. The regency, while offering a glimpse into the queen's potential for power, ultimately served as a stark reminder of its tenuous, temporary, and often contested nature, making it the ultimate limitation on a queen's actual power in 1192.